There are moments in life when everything feels heavy, not because the world has stopped, but because something inside you feels like it's running out of strength. You don't need another opinion in those moments. You don't need another explanation. You don't need more advice. What you need is something deeper, something that pulls you back into yourself. Because the truth is, most people don't lose their way in life because they are incapable. They lose it because they forget how to stand strong when nothing around them is making sense. And right now, if you're listening to this, maybe you're in that exact place, where answers feel unclear, pressure feels constant, and your own thoughts feel louder than the world itself. But this message is not here to add noise to your mind. It is here to do the opposite. Stay with this, because what you are about to hear is not motivational talk for a moment. It is a shift in how you understand strength, silence, pain, decisions, and the power you've been carrying all along without fully realizing it. And by the end of this, you may not look at your struggles the same way again. You may not even look at yourself the same way again. Strength is not something that arrives from outside. It is born within the human mind when a person decides to stand firm, even when everything around them feels uncertain in life. People often believe that advice from others will give them the power to move forward. But real strength does not come from hearing more opinions. It comes from deciding what to ignore and what to accept. The human mind becomes fragile when it depends too much on external validation, because every new voice adds another layer of doubt, and slowly the inner conviction begins to fade. However, when a person learns to trust their own judgment, even in moments of pressure, something powerful begins to grow inside them. They stop waiting for permission to act and start relying on their own awareness of what is right for them. Strength becomes a silent that does not need approval from others, because it is rooted in self-belief, not in external noise. Many people lose their direction, not because they are weak, but because they keep listening to too many directions at once and forget that clarity comes when you filter out the unnecessary voices and focus on what your inner understanding is already telling you. Even in moments of confusion, there is always a quiet signal within that guides decision-making, but it becomes harder to hear when external advice is louder than internal conviction. Real strength is not about rejecting all guidance, but about recognizing when to pause and return to your own foundation of thought, where decisions are not borrowed from others but shaped through personal reflection and lived experience. When this shift happens, a person stops being dependent on reassurance and starts developing a steady internal confidence that does not collapse under pressure. Even in difficult situations, they remain anchored in their own understanding of what must be done. They choose to move forward becomes less about outside influence and more about inner certainty. Grows further when a person begins to understand that mistakes are not failures but part of strengthening the mental structure that supports future decisions. Each experience, whether good or bad, becomes a building block of resilience, and over time the need for constant external approval naturally weakens, because the individual starts trusting the process of their own thinking more than the opinions surrounding them. This is where real independence of mind begins to take shape, and the person becomes less reactive to noise and more aligned with purpose and direction that is self-determined. Even when uncertainty exists, there remains a quiet trust in personal judgment that keeps movement alive without needing constant external reinforcement. Forward. Silence often restores power in a way that words and advice cannot, because when a person is surrounded by constant opinions, suggestions, and interpretations, the mind becomes overloaded and begins to lose its natural ability to think clearly. In moments of struggle, many people rush to talk about their problems or seek immediate guidance, but this habit sometimes creates more confusion because every external voice adds another layer of processing that the mind must handle. When a person steps away from noise and enters silence, there is a gradual return of mental clarity where thoughts that were once scattered begin to settle and organize themselves naturally without force. Silence is not emptiness, it is a space where internal strength begins to rebuild itself, because the absence of external influence allows the individual to reconnect with their own reasoning and emotional balance. In this state, the mind starts filtering what truly matters and what is simply distraction, and this filtering process strengthens decision-making because it reduces dependency on outside validation. Many of the strongest decisions in life are not made in loud environments, but in quiet moments where a person is not reacting to others, but responding to their own understanding. Silence also helps in reducing emotional pressure, because when external voices are removed, the intensity of confusion decreases, and what remains is a more stable inner awareness that is easier to work with. often underestimate silence because they associate power with action and speech. But real internal rebuilding happens when the mind is allowed to rest from constant input. In silence, past experiences also become clearer, and instead of being emotional burdens, they transform into lessons that can be understood without distortion from outside influence. This process slowly rebuilds confidence because when a person realizes they can think clearly without relying on constant advice, they begin to trust their own mental structure again. Silence strengthens patience as well, because it teaches a person to wait for clarity instead of rushing into decisions driven by confusion or pressure from others. Over time, silence becomes a form of strength training for the mind. And necessary thoughts lose their power, and essential thoughts become more dominant. Becomes less reactive and more intentional, because actions are no longer driven by noise, but by a steady internal rhythm of understanding. Your mind becomes what it repeatedly hears, because repetition is one of the most powerful forces shaping human belief systems and emotional patterns. And over time, what a person listens to consistently begins to transform into the internal dialogue that governs their decisions, reactions, and expectations in life. When someone is constantly exposed to doubt, fear, criticism, or negativity, even in subtle forms, their subconscious mind starts absorbing those patterns and slowly begins to treat them as truth, not because they are objectively correct, but because repetition creates familiarity. And the mind naturally confuses familiarity with safety and truth. This is why environments matter so deeply, because the external input you allow into your awareness does not stay external for long. It becomes internal structure, shaping how you interpret challenges, opportunities, and even your own abilities. When a person repeatedly hears discouraging words, they begin to unconsciously adjust their behavior to match that energy. Sometimes without even realizing it, they start hesitating more, avoiding risks, and questioning their own judgment more frequently. Not because their ability has changed, but because their mental programming has been influenced through repetition. On the other hand, when a person deliberately chooses to expose themselves to empowering ideas, constructive thinking, and disciplined perspectives, their internal narrative slowly begins to shift as well, and the mind starts to build a different identity, one that is more resilient, focused, and solution-oriented. This transformation does not happen in a single moment. It happens gradually through consistent exposure, which is why what you repeatedly consume mentally becomes more important than what you occasionally understand intellectually, because understanding repetition fades, but repetition without full understanding still creates conditioning. Over time, the human brain begins to align with dominant input, meaning if you constantly hear limitations, you begin to act limited. But if you consistently hear possibility, discipline, and strength, you begin to operate from those states, even when circumstances have not yet changed. This is also why internal conversations matter just as much as external ones, because self-talk is the most repeated message any person hears throughout their entire life. If that internal dialogue is filled with doubt, hesitation, or fear, it becomes a self-reinforcing cycle that shapes every decision. But when trained to focus on persistence, learning, and control, it builds a edge that is difficult to break. Under pressure, the powering thoughts creates new and about training perception so that challenges are processed differently, not as threats, but as situations to navigate with clarity and control, which eventually leads to a mindset where external noise loses influence and internal direction becomes dominant and consistent. regardless of surroundings. Pain is not designed to signal defeat or withdrawal, but to act as a form of internal training that reshapes the way a person thinks, reacts, and ultimately grows in strength, because every meaningful transformation in human character is preceded by discomfort that forces the mind to expand beyond its previous limits. When a person encounters struggle, the natural reaction is often resistance or avoidance, but what is often misunderstood is that this very resistance is the beginning of development, not the end of it, because without pressure there is no refinement, and without challenge there is no strengthening of mental structure in life. Pain often appears when a person is stepping beyond familiar territory, and this discomfort is not a warning to stop, but rather a sign that growth is actively taking place at a deeper level than immediate perception can understand. The human mind tends to associate comfort with safety and discomfort with danger. But in reality, many of the most powerful advancements in confidence, discipline, and emotional control are born directly from situations that initially felt overwhelming or even unbearable, because those moments force an individual to question their limits, and in doing so they often discover that the limits they believed in were not fixed but flexible and expandable. Pain has a way of stripping away unnecessary illusions about control, forcing a person to confront reality without distraction or denial, and in that confrontation there is an opportunity to rebuild perspective with greater clarity and resilience. Every difficult experience carries within it a hidden structure of lessons that only becomes visible when the emotional reaction begins to settle and the mind starts analyzing instead of reacting impulsively. This is where real strength begins to form, not in the absence of difficulty, but in the ability to remain present within it without surrendering to it completely. When a person learns to stay engaged with their struggle instead of escaping it, they begin to develop an internal stability that does not depend on external conditions. And this stability becomes the foundation for future confidence, because they now understand through direct experience that pain does not break them. It reshapes them, and in this reshaping process, old weaknesses are gradually replaced by stronger patterns of thought. Discipline becomes more natural, decisions become more intentional, and emotional reactions become more controlled, not because pain disappears, but because its meaning changes from something to avoid into something to understand and work through. And in that shift, the individual starts to realize that every moment of suffering carried within it the raw material of advancement that was waiting to be used rather than resisted. And as this realization deepens, the entire relationship with difficulty transforms into a process of continuous internal evolution, where pressure becomes part of development rather than interruption. Strength in a person does not emerge from endless discussion or repeated explanation of their problems, but from the moment they decide within themselves that change is necessary and action must follow, because discussion alone keeps the mind trapped in a cycle of awareness without movement, while decisions force the mind into commitment, where energy is no longer scattered across opinions, but directed toward a clear direction of action. A person keeps talking about their struggles, temporary relief, but that relief does not translate into progress, because speaking about a problem repeatedly can sometimes create the illusion of effort without actual transformation, and over time this habit weakens inner drive because the mind begins to associate expression with progress rather than execution, whereas true strength develops when a person reaches a point where they stop negotiating with their circumstances and start choosing their response, regardless of how difficult the situation appears. Decision-making is powerful because it removes uncertainty from the emotional system and replaces it with direction, even if the outcome is not immediately visible. The act of deciding itself creates psychological stability because the mind now has a path to follow instead of remaining stuck in analysis and hesitation. Many people remain in a loop of overthinking where they revisit the same thoughts from different angles, hoping for clarity, but clarity rarely comes from repetition of thought. It comes from the courage to choose a direction and accept responsibility for it. Once a decision is made, energy that was previously consumed by doubt becomes available for execution, and this shift is what separates temporary from lasting strength, because motivation depends on feeling, but decision depends on commitment, and commitment does not fluctuate with emotion. When a person decides to rise above their condition, they begin to reclaim control over their internal world, even if external circumstances remain unchanged, because decision changes identity. It tells the mind that the individual is no longer waiting for permission or perfect timing, but is actively participating in shaping their own outcome. This internal shift gradually builds resilience because each decision, followed by action, reinforces self-trust and reduces dependency on external validation or reassurance. And as this pattern continues, the person starts to develop a stronger sense of direction, where problems are no longer processed as obstacles that require endless discussion, but as situations that require response and movement. And in this state, the mind becomes more disciplined, focused, and less vulnerable to distraction or emotional collapse, because it understands that real strength is not found in how much one talks about change, but in how consistently one chooses to act upon it, even when conditions are not ideal or when results are not immediately visible. The moment of decision becomes a turning point where hesitation loses power and action begins to define identity, and through repeated commitment to decisions, the individual slowly transitions into a state where life is no longer experienced as something to analyze endlessly, but something to shape actively through continuous choices that reinforce direction, clarity, and purpose that keeps growing without waiting for perfect conditions or external approval. And this is where transformation truly begins to stabilize within a person's mindset, as they realize that everything meaningful they have ever wanted was always waiting on the other side of a single decisive moment that they have yet to fully claim by stepping into it without hesitation and continuing forward even when uncertainty remains present, because stopping to discuss what should be done keeps a person in the same place, but deciding and moving changes the entire structure of their experience and identity in ways that cannot be reversed once initiated. And then why decisions carry the weight of transformation. Discussions often remain only as echoes of intention that fade without action, unless they are converted into movement that continues without pause or doubt or delay. A person is often trapped by the belief that their current emotional state defines their actual strength. But emotions are temporary conditions that rise and fall based on circumstances, thoughts, and external pressure, while inner potential remains constant regardless of how one feels in a given moment. When someone feels weak, overwhelmed, or uncertain, it does not mean their strength has disappeared. It simply means their mind is passing through a temporary phase where emotional weight is dominating perception. Human psychology is deeply influenced by momentary feelings, which can distort reality and make a person underestimate their ability to handle situations that they are actually capable of managing. This is why many people give up too early, not because they lack power, but because they identify too strongly with how they feel in that specific moment. Real strength begins when a person learns to separate him from identity and understands that feeling is not fact, it is feedback that changes with time and experience. Every individual has within them a deeper layer of capability that it's not affected by fear, doubt, or stress, but it becomes hidden when intense intensity takes control of thinking. In difficult moments, the mind tends to magnify problems and shrink possibilities, creating a false sense of limitation that feels real but is not permanent. The truth is that strength is often the most active when it's least felt, because it operates beneath emotional noise. Stability. As to their emotions, instead of becoming controlled by them, they begin to access a more stable form of awareness where decisions are no longer dictated by temporary discomfort but guided by a clear understanding of long-term capability. This shift allows individuals to move forward even when they do not feel ready, because readiness is often a feeling that follows action rather than precedes it. Many breakthroughs in life occur precisely at the point where a person feels least capable but chooses to continue anyway, and in that continuation they discover that their limits were never as fixed as their emotions suggested. Over time, this understanding builds emotional resilience, where fluctuations in mood no longer determine direction, and consistency becomes stronger than temporary weakness. The mind becomes trained to recognize that emotional states are passing conditions, not permanent definitions of self, and this recognition creates a powerful sense of internal stability. Awareness deepens, a person starts trusting their underlying strength more than their surface emotions. which allows them to act with greater courage during uncertain times. This does not eliminate difficulty, but it changes how difficulty is experienced, transforming it from a stopping point into a passing phase within a larger process of growth and endurance that continues regardless of emotional variation. In the end, this message is not just about understanding strength, silence, pain, decisions, or inner potential separately, but about realizing how they all work together to shape the way you face life. True strength is never loud, never dependent on constant advice, and never defined by temporary emotions. It is built quietly in moments when you choose to think for yourself, when you step into silence to regain clarity, when you endure pain without running from its lesson, when you decide instead of hesitate, and when you remember that your feelings are not your final truth. Life will always bring uncertainty, pressure, and moments that test your limits. But those moments are not there to stop you. They are there to reveal what you are capable of becoming when you refuse to give up control of your inner world.
Everything you need to rise has already been placed within you, and the only real challenge is learning to access it consistently, especially when circumstances try to convince you otherwise. Good luck on your journey ahead. May you carry this understanding not just as words, but as a way of thinking that strengthens you in real moments of struggle and decision. Stay steady, stay aware, and trust the power you already hold within yourself. Thank you for your time and attention.